Now like to introduce our guest speaker, Joel Morwood. Joel will be speaking on a spiritual basis for approaching dying and death. Originally from New York, as I'm sure you'll be able to hear, Joel is a scholar of spirituality with a remarkably deep and wide knowledge of the world's major religious and mystical traditions. He is himself a longtime practitioner and teacher of mysticism and leads a practice group in Eugene, Oregon, called the Center for Sacred Sciences. He is the author of Through Death's Gate, A Guide to Selfless Dying, and 2 other books, including the just published and very well-reviewed The Way of Selflessness, A Practical Guide to Enlightenment based on the teachings of the world's great mystics. His books are available from Amazon and so on, but that one book on the death thing can be downloaded for free from his website. So. Just to be complete about Joel's resume, he is also a Vietnam vet, a former radical revolutionary, and then he had a long, successful career in Hollywood where he was an associate producer for The Jazz Singer and worked on a lot of other big shows. So please welcome Joel Morwood.
Thank you. It was a short career in Hollywood, not a long. First of all, let me say, as I'm an outsider, I'm not in the medical profession, and listening to you guys, I'm so impressed. I hope if I get a terminal illness, it's here in San Mateo County, I'll tell you. And also, just one other little note, I have cataracts. I'm going to have a surgery in December, but in the meantime, couldn't get it for this meeting. So any of you, particularly in the back, you really got to wave or just speak out if you have a question, because I won't see you. Okay, so Steve asked me to give you a crash course in mysticism and how it relates to death and dying, all in 30 minutes here. So it's a tall order, but I'm going to try. And first of all, let me say, guys, you can hear me in the back there? Good. When I talk about mysticism, it's quite restricted. I don't mean astrology or numerology or palm reading or a lot of activities that sometimes are covered by the term mysticism. What I'm talking about is what we might call classic mysticism. And I would define a mystic, or the mystics, as those men and women that you'll find in all traditions throughout history in different times and places and so forth, all who have claimed to have had a direct apprehension of ultimate reality. And in different traditions, of course, this reality has different names. It's God, or Brahman, or Allah, or Buddha nature, or the Tao, depending on the tradition. But actually, one of the striking things about mystics of their own intersubjective agreement is they all say this ultimate reality cannot really be grasped by thought or described in words. So let me just give you a flavor. Let me read you a couple of mystics here. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, begins his Tao Te Ching, his book, the Tao Te Ching, by saying, "The Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao." He goes on to write 81 verses, but he's alerting you in the very first verse that we can talk around it, but we can't actually talk about it. Here's the ancient Hindu Upanishads. "The Spirit Supreme is immeasurable, beyond conception, never born, beyond reasoning, beyond thought." And the Christian mystic Teresa of Avila, she writes, "All I say falls short of the truth, which is indescribable." And she doesn't mean it's indescribable the way your mother's apple pie is indescribable because it's so good. She means it literally cannot be described. And in fact, the word mysticism comes from a Greek word, mustes, I believe it's pronounced, which is related to our word mute. So it means closed mouth. You can't speak. So that's the essence of this, and it's the first point of agreement among these mystics of all these various traditions. So then the question is, why can't we speak about this? And the answer given by the mystics of these traditions, and by the way, I'm only speaking about the mystics. There are many other leaders and theologians and so forth of various traditions that are not mystics. But the mystics say this ultimate reality is non-dual. This nature is non-dual. Here we go again. Huang Po, Zen master. Away with your dualism. Every single thing is just the one mind. And here's the Hindu mystic Lali Shwari. She says, everything is the one Shiva. There is no such thing as two. And here's the Christian mystic, Meister Eckhart. If we will see things truly, they are strangers to everything that tolerates any distinction, be it in a thought or in a name. They are intimates of the one that is bare of any kind of multiplicity and distinction. So, why should this be the case? And we can see this by the simple act of naming. If I name glasses, this object, I, in a sense, create an imaginary boundary around it that separates it from everything else. And if I go around naming other things, your names, my name, tables, chairs, and so forth, I end up with a world of multiplicities. So it's just in the act of naming, in the act of speaking, and then speaking reflecting our thoughts, we create these distinctions. That is the purpose of speech, by the way, to create distinctions. Speech doesn't make any sense if we can't distinguish one word from another. And there's nothing wrong, according to the mystics, with creating distinctions, with speaking and thinking and so forth. That is not the problem. The problem is we create these boundaries, we create these distinctions, we superimpose them on the non-dual reality, and then we take them to be real, to have a status that they don't actually have. We reify them, to use the technical term. And in particular, we reify the boundary between I and other, self and world, subject and object. And that's the one that the mystics focus on, because this is the one that causes us so many problems. This is really, according to mystics, the root of our suffering. So we suffer for two reasons once we've reified that boundary, two main reasons. Now, I got to tell you, I'm way oversimplifying here because of our time constraints, and I'm giving you a sketch. You may not be all that interested in have a more elaborate explanation, and you can find one if you are. But just the fact of feeling ourselves to be a separate self is already suffering, because in a certain sense we feel cut off from the cosmos and our fellow beings. So we have this kind of existential loneliness. And based on that loneliness, we also then identify ourselves usually with a body-mind, and we are aware that all objects and things in the world are impermanent. So here we are, we feel we are exclusively this body-mind, and then we feel threatened. Someday this body-mind is going to die. And so then we have this fear of death and this loneliness, and this sets up our strategy for life. We start to spend our lives trying to grasp and to hold the things that will enhance and protect this self, and trying to avoid the things that are going to threaten this self, namely the big ones, sickness, old age, and death. And so this becomes what governs everything we do. And this is something you can check out yourself, by the way. And what mystics always say is these are teachings we always have to check out ourselves, check out on our own experience. But, from the day we wake up in the morning, usually it's like, what's going to make me happy? What do we have for breakfast? Oh, Cheerios. Oh, great. That's great. Oh, I don't know, oatmeal. Nah, that's not going to make me happy. So we're making these choices based on that all day long. And then we also start to develop stories about what we're doing. Little stories, and they all get woven into a big story, which I call the story of I. And if you read through mystical literature, you'll find that the ego, or the I, is considered the big problem. And it's really this fictional character, from a mystic's point of view, in this story, this ongoing story, that we are so fascinated with, it absorbs our attention. It's just like a soap opera playing in your head. You can, again, test this. Sit in a room someday with people talking in the other room. And they can talk. You may be reading a book. You can ignore them. But when they start talking about you, see if you can go on reading the book to test this out. So here's what Anandamoyamai says about this. She was a great Hindu mystic. Everything in this world is transitory. So also worldly happiness. It comes and the next moment it is gone. If permanent, abiding happiness is to be found, that which is eternal will have to be realized. And this brings us to the second problem from mystics' point of view of this story of I and this absorption in the story of I. As long as we are totally absorbed in this story, we literally ignore our true nature. We're completely wrapped up in the strategy to get what we want and avoid what we don't want, and our attention is skipping over what we really are. And this strategy is futile, ultimately. Ultimately, everything that we want and try to grab is impermanent. And even if we do grab something that's longer lasting than we are impermanent. And in this hospital situation, I mean, this is something you face every day. So I don't have to preach to the choir on this one. So the best we can get is temporary happiness out of this way of living. But finally, it's all going to be taken away from us. But as long as we're living this way, we're trying to do something that is impossible. No wonder we suffer. We're bound to suffer. Here's what the Sufi master, and the Sufis are the mystics of Islam, here's Javad Nurbakash, and here's what he says. As long as you are you, you will be miserable and impoverished. But when yourself has passed away, you are the beloved, content and fulfilled. And the beloved is the Sufi name for the divine. And perhaps more accurately, he should have said, or we should interpret it as long as this illusion that you are a separate self is there, you will be impoverished. And when that passes away, then you can realize your true nature. And this realization has different names in different traditions: enlightenment, gnosis, union with God, all sorts of different names. But if you read through the mystics and you read their descriptions, you see that they're remarkably similar. Here's the Tibetan master, Dojam Lingpa, and he says, what constitutes realization? It is simply understanding correctly one's own true nature as the fundamental nature of reality. And this realization, the thing about it is it bypasses that story. It's not a theory about the nature of reality. It's not thoughts about it. It's an immediate experience, we might say, although I put experience in quotes. It's somewhat like hearing about a mango. And you read descriptions of what a mango tastes like, and people tell you how wonderful it is and so forth. And you might even form some idea. Somebody might say, well, it's like a peach, but it's a little bit more tart, and you know. But until you've tasted a mango, you really don't know what a mango is. And so this is what this realization or enlightenment is really about. It's something that's beyond the mind. It bypasses those intellectual processes. Here's the Upanishads again, talking about Brahman, which is their name for the ultimate reality. He comes to the thought of those who know him beyond thought. He is known in the ecstasy of an awakening, which opens the door of life eternal. And here's the Christian mystic Dionysius the Areopagite, and he's describing this union with the divine. The mystic plunges into the darkness of unknowing, and through the inactivity of all his reasoning powers is united by his highest faculty to him who is wholly unknowable. Thus, by knowing nothing, he knows that which is beyond his knowledge. So, for mystics, this realization, this enlightenment is the goal of spiritual life, and once attained, it's the end of the path. This, by the way, is a little bit of a digression. It's why in all mystical traditions you'll find this emphasis on cultivating selfless love and compassion. Because selfless love and compassion gives us an experience of living from a different motivation than everything for me, I, me, and mine. So whenever we are acting out of true selfless love and compassion, we don't have ourselves as the primary item on the agenda. And the more we do that, the more we realize, oh, the direction of happiness really lies in this direction, not this futile activity of trying to get what we can't actually hold on to. So that's kind of that's the crash course. And that's really the barest brushstrokes. I said there's a lot more to fill in about meditation and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested, you can pursue that. But then the question is, what does all this have to do with death and dying? And we have to go back and zero in a little bit more on this realization, this enlightenment, this union with the divine. And according to the mystics, there are certain opportunities in life, primary opportunities, for this realization to happen. One of them is between two thoughts. When one thought arises and passes away, and another thought arises and passes away. There's a little space, and in that space, there's the opportunity for this awakening. Here's the Tibetan master Milarepa. And here's what he says. In the gap between two thoughts, thought-free wakefulness manifests unceasingly. So this is why, if you've read anything about Zen Buddhism, for instance, there are all these stories about how the Zen student wakes up, the master blows out a candle flame, it's gone, and it disappears, and that opens the student's mind. If you've been prepared for this through years of meditation and so forth, you can notice this gap between one thought or one phenomena or another. But that's the trouble. The gap is just extremely brief, and our minds are constantly skipping over it. We're always looking for the next thought, the next phenomenon, the next thing, that's coming up on the horizon. So that's difficult. This opportunity also happens to us when we're falling asleep, or waking up on the other end, but falling asleep is easier, actually. Here's what the Hindu text Centering has to say. At the moment of sleep, when sleep has not yet come and external wakefulness vanishes, at this point, being is revealed. So every night you go to sleep, and as you fade into sleep and before the dreams start up, you have this opportunity to wake up. By the way, this opportunity is not, according to the mystics, is not exclusive to one tradition or religion or whatever. It's every human being's opportunity. Some mystics will tell you their tradition is, better, and but basically this is the birthright of every human being. But the trouble is, when we fall asleep, again, our minds are distracted by plans and worries and so forth. It's that story of I rolling along again, and we just literally overlook it. The way we interpret that moment is a being blacked out. There was nothing there, so it's like we went unconscious. And then dreams start up again. Well, there's the story of I again, so we're missing it again. And then we go into dreamless sleep, but there's nothing there, and it's like we're waiting for the next dream to come along. So the point here, the main point I'm trying to make, is our attention is constantly distracted, constantly distracted. Now, there is another opportunity that comes from cultivating what in the East they call samadhi, or states of deep absorption that you can do through meditation, where you really train to still the mind so thoughts aren't arising. In fact, you can get into such deep states of samadhi that no phenomena is arising. It's really like being lucid in dreamless sleep. And particularly in the Eastern traditions, they cultivate that, because that's, again, an opportunity for awakening. But again, the trouble is, for most people, especially if you're leading a householder's life, you're not a monk or a nun, it takes tremendous effort, and most of us don't have the time and whatnot, or even the interest maybe, to go ahead and be cultivating these deep states of meditation. So that's another possibility, but again, each of these has their advantage and disadvantage. And the disadvantages for most people are, especially as leading a householder's life, are very strong. But at the time of death is the golden opportunity that opens up for everybody. And every mystical tradition recognizes this, because death removes those distractions. During life, if we want to pursue a mystical path, we have to struggle against them. They're always there. They're always arising and calling our attention away. But as we're dying, one by one, they're taken away from us. So in a certain sense, death is cooperating with our spiritual practice now. And it strips us down so there is nothing left to distract us. Here's an anonymous Kabbalist. The Kabbalists are the mystics of the Jewish tradition. And he's talking about the death of a mystic, or the mystics. It is said that they died with the kiss. That is, that at the moment they departed, they attained the essence of all apprehensions. So that's enlightenment. Because the obstacles which are in the world left them, and the intellect returned to cleave to the light which is the divine intellect. So here's this idea right there expressed. It's all going to be removed. It's all going to be taken away. I like to say that actually this is like the proof of God goes like this. If you remove everything from consciousness, what's left is God. So it's hard to do, but actually at death, according to the mystics, this is what's going to happen. So what does this have to do with you? I puzzled myself after I got to the end of this. I thought, he's asked me to give you this crash course. I doubt most of you are going to run out and become mystics or something like that. And more importantly, perhaps, I doubt most of the people who show up at this hospital are going to be mystics pursuing an active mystical path. So you won't be able to sit down with them and say, oh, gee, why don't you read Joel's book? It's designed for mystics who are dying. But I do think it's probably accurate to say that all the major religious traditions view death in one way or another as a gateway to the divine, whatever their term for it is, and however they conceive it. And they might conceive it in more what I would consider mythological forms. They might have a different theology about it. It might involve lots of ideas about an after death states or states and so forth and so on. But this essential idea that it could be the crowning opportunity of a lifetime, I think you'll find embedded in all, at least in most spiritual traditions. And so some of the people who are going to come in here are going to be religious, or they're going to come from a religious background. And that's something maybe to focus on, that it's not just the fact that they're religious, but what does this mean in terms of the death experience, or the possibilities, I should say, of the death experience. And then somebody mentioned this already, even people who are not particularly religious, have not been religious in their lives, as they're facing death, sometimes get religion, so to speak, or they at least get an interest in what's going to be happening. My own mother is a very good example of that. She was 93 years old. She lived the last 20 years of her life in Mexico. And in the last couple of years, she had a fractured hip. She was confined to going around on a walker. She had to depend on her friends to come take her out. Her life was getting more and more restricted. And finally, her favorite restaurant, where she went every Sunday and had a margarita and some fish, the chef left and the food went downhill. And so she called up her doctor in Mexico, and she showed up, and she said, okay, I've had it. I'm ready to die. I want to see what's on the other side. And, he called me and my brother up, and he said, oh, your mother's here, and there's nothing wrong with her, really, except that she's old. And we said, tell her to hang on. But she was a very self-willed, strong-willed woman. Just like in life, she didn't wait for us. She was gone in like 2 days. But she was really curious at the end. I mean, so there was a shift of focus in her life from this life, and she had led a full, rich life. There was nothing, overtly spiritual about her. She wasn't an ascetic or anything like that. But at the very last there, her attention shifted. So again, I think this is something that you probably are aware that this happens, but I just want to reinforce the importance this can have for somebody. Instead of looking at death as the most awful, horrible thing that could possibly happen to me, maybe it's going to be a wonderful thing that happens to me. Rumi, who is a great Sufi mystic and poet, called death our wedding with eternity, which I think is for a mystic, it's a beautiful way of expressing this. It's our wedding with eternity. Whatever the form of someone's belief, from a mystic's point of view, is not nearly as important as the attitude. The attitude being just that, the attitude of beginning to detach from this life and turn to what's coming with an openness and a surrender and a sense of a curiosity and devotion and to embrace. Rather than, being dragged off the dance floor, screaming and yelling. And everything that is possible to encourage this, everything that you can suggest or do or whatever, I would think, from the point of view of a mystic, would be extremely helpful. And some people have mentioned some of these things, but the people, and you deal with it all the time. I've dealt with a few people in our community who have died. But the things that have been important are like spiritual pictures. And be very aware of different traditions have different, somebody from a Hindu tradition may have a guru, that to have a picture of the guru may be very valuable to them. That being in a foreign setting, they may be kind of reluctant to sort of take over and change the room. I don't know, if I could imagine a Christian dying in Nepal might be reluctant to want a crucifix or ask for one. But if you make it plain that you're aware that different traditions have these different symbols and they could be available, different music, spiritual music they might want to have. In some traditions, reading a text at the time of death is very important. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they actually have a book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that's the English translation, that is designed to be read to a dying person, to remind them to look for the clear light of bliss, as they call it, that will open up at the time of death. So these kinds of things, first of all, to expect if the people and their family want them, but also even to, you could, ask, is this kind of thing you would like to have? I've discovered sometimes that people in my group, and we are very eclectic. We have people who have no tradition particularly, or people who come from other traditions and so forth. But one of the things that people who do come from a strong background, Christian, most of them come from Christian, Jewish, or we have one guy from a Muslim background, even though they may have been fallen away, don't do the 5 prayers a day, and so forth and so on, there's still a deep identification with the tradition, which may surface at the time of death, even if they have, as I said, not really been practicing it, and come out. And so this is something that, again, you can, you can lead them on. Is this going to be important? Is this something you would like? So just really, and then one other thing, in most traditions, they have a death prayer. Sometimes it's a specific prayer designed for dying, but sometimes it's just maybe the major prayer of the tradition. Like in Orthodox Jewish tradition, to die saying Shema, which is probably the most sacred prayer in Judaism, on your lips, is considered a good death. And other traditions have a similar thing. So that's something else that you could suggest. But really here, I think the most important thing I want to communicate is this shift of attitude. A shift of attitude is viewing death as something horrendous and horrible and whatnot, to a shift of attitude is that it may be really something quite spectacular and quite marvelous. And I want to sum it up from a little story from the Sufi tradition, a little bit of a dialogue between Rabia, and she was one of the great early Sufis, and the angel of death. And the angel of death says, I am the murderer of joy, the widower of wives, the orphaner of children. And Rabia says, why always run yourself down? Why not instead say, I am he who brings friend and friend together? And the friend is the divine, a metaphor for the divine. So, that's my crash course and how mysticism relates to death and dying.